Joanna of Castile has gone down in history as the Mad, remembered only for her supposed mental illness that prevented her from holding the Castilian crown that was hers by right. But is that the truth? Was Joanna really mad? Or was there something more sinister at play? Joanna was born in Toledo on the 6th of November 1479. She was the second daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and her mother, Queen Isabella I of Castile, and their third child. Before her was her elder sister, also named Isabella, and her brother, Juan, the heir presumptive to his parents' collective thrones. Joanna would not therefore have been raised to wear a crown, but simply to be a royal wife. Joanna was given, like her sisters, an education worthy of their brothers. While education for royal princesses by the 15th century was better than for ordinary girls, the education the Spanish infantas received was unprecedented. Alongside mathematics, reading, writing and music, Joanna was also taught philosophy, law, history and Latin. The only area where there was some neglect was foreign languages. Sources state that Joanna was a highly intelligent and quick student, something that was noted of her throughout her life. Much has been made of her relationship with her parents, especially her mother, based mostly on a single piece of evidence from one of Ferdinand's servants, Mosen Luis Fefa. Isabella I was a devout Catholic and famous for starting the feared Spanish Inquisition. She was known for her devotion to her religion, to the extent that those who refused to follow Catholicism were forced to either convert or go to prison. Being a naturally intelligent and questioning young girl, Joanna is reported as having sometimes expressed doubts about part of her religion when she reached her teens, and this single source states that her mother, horrified at her daughter's refusals to attend Mass and confession, risked her daughter's mortal life for her immortal soul. The source goes on to say Isabella suspended her 15-year-old daughter Joanna with a rope, attaching weights around her feet. In short, she tortured her to make her accept Catholicism. This story has been accepted throughout the ages and used as proof in Joanna's lifetime for her supposed madness. But is it really true? This story assumes that Isabella was a mother who would put her daughter's life in danger. But there is more evidence to the contrary. The Spanish royal children were firstly very well looked after to the point of indulgence. Ferdinand sourced expensive dolls to gift his daughters, and Isabella ensured all of her children were clothed in the latest beautiful fabrics and trimmings with the most expensive accessories, even for outfits worn only within their households. While Isabella herself had to be suitably decked out in finery for public royal occasions, she disliked opulence and in private wore much simpler clothes. This shows a mother and father who wanted to indulge their children with every possible luxury and happiness a child could have in the 15th century. They were also a close-knit family who travelled together, and Isabella refused to be apart from her children when moving around their various palaces. In later years, when Princess Isabella, the eldest daughter, returned home from becoming a young widow to Prince Afonso of Portugal, while remarriage to secure peace with Portugal was necessary, Queen Isabella ensured her eldest daughter was left to mourn for a few years and be ready to marry again instead, despite the importance of the alliance. Joanna's mother, therefore, sounds like a loving parent who wanted to care for her children, not harm them. Secondly, on a practical level, harming any of their children would dynastically have been detrimental for Ferdinand and Isabella. Their kingdoms were threatened by the growing might of France, and they needed allies against this. Allies would be gained by marrying off their 5 surviving children to countries and kingdoms that would shore up defences against France. And so losing a child would mean threatening the stability of their respective kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. Therefore, even if Isabella hadn't cared for her children in a maternalistic way, and there is plenty of evidence to suggest this wasn't the case, she still wouldn't have risked their lives even for the sake of religion. There were plenty of other, gentler ways to convince her daughter to follow Catholicism before torturing her. This means that while it cannot outright be discredited, other evidence casts doubt on the validity of Mohsen Louis Pfeffer's story that Queen Isabella would go so far as to torture her child. In the particular environment of 15th century Spain, the story probably served a double purpose for Ferdinand after his wife's death: that Joanna was insane, and that his wife was devout enough to try saving their daughter's soul through any means, giving her legitimacy after death. In 1496, when Joanna was 16, she was betrothed to the 18-year-old Philip, Duke of Burgundy, known as the Fair. Dynastically, it was a good match for the Spanish royals, as not only would Burgundy prove a useful ally against the French in the north, but Philip's father was Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, providing yet more connections to strengthen their kingdoms. Although the Infanta would be merely an archduchess, one day she could become an empress. Even better, it was a dual wedding, as Philip's sister Margaret was to travel to Spain to marry Joanna's brother Juan. After a proxy wedding at Palacio de los Vivero, the place her parents had secretly married years before, Joanna set out in August 1496 for the Burgundian lands. It was too dangerous to travel through France, and so the messenger sent ahead to tell the Burgundian court of Joanna's arrival ended up travelling with her fleet, and the journey was a difficult one. So when the Spanish Infanta arrived, no one had been prepared for her arrival, and it would be 4 weeks before Joanna would see her future husband. Away at an imperial diet in Lindau, Philip immediately set out to meet his new bride at Lier, in modern-day Belgium. When he arrived at the convent where she was staying, he was so taken with Joanna that apparently he demanded instead that the wedding take place immediately, instead of in a week's time as planned, in order that the wedding might be consummated immediately. Sadly for Joanna, Philip's desire for a constant new sexual spark would spell disaster for their marriage with his infidelity. Their marriage took place as planned on the 20th of October at St. Gumaruska in Lier, and at first was happy. But it wasn't long before Philip showed his true colours. For Joanna's part, she fulfilled the role of a noble wife perfectly, giving birth to 6 children who went on to become emperors or queens. Eleanor, born in 1498 and later Queen of France and Portugal; Charles in 1500, who would go to become Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V and King of Spain as Charles I; Isabella in 1501, named for her maternal grandmother and later Queen of Denmark, Norway and Sweden; Ferdinand in 1503, who would be Archduke of Austria, King of Germany and later Bohemia and Hungary, and Holy Roman Emperor after his brother; Mary of Austria, who would become Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, and the youngest, Catherine, who went on to become Queen of Portugal. Joanna's sister Catherine would have probably envied the ease with which Joanna seemed to produce surviving heirs. However, Philip did not show his wife any respect for her position or fulfilment of her duties. While Joanna had been met by enthusiastic crowds on her arrival in Burgundy, as well as many nobles who greeted her with happiness, there were other courtiers who would have preferred an alliance with France and made no attempts to hide the fact. Within this frosty atmosphere, it would seem Philip began controlling his young and inexperienced wife, who was still getting to grips with the murkiness of politics at court. Queen Isabella, worried about her daughter, sent an envoy in the form of Friar Tomás de Matienzo, sub-prior of the convent of Santa Cruz. The reports sent back reveal a young woman who felt powerless to do anything other than accept her situation, and depressed and accepting of all consequences as a result. Joanna should have been allowed, according to royal protocol, to run her own household. However, Philip demanded she relinquish this right to him, and he and his councillors would not allow her to take part in it, as she stated. Philip also broke his marriage contract by not paying Joanna the annual sum he was supposed to for her allowance, instead giving the money to his own administrators. This left Joanna too poor to pay for most of her staff, something Philip clearly wanted, resulting in 80 of her 98 male Spanish servants leaving her. Many of those who remained were bribed to follow Philip's orders rather than Joanna's, and it left gaps for Philip to fill with his own choice of servants. He further insisted that instead of Joanna keeping her trusted Spanish lady-in-waiting, Donna Marina Manuel, she was to be replaced with Madame de Halwyn, once his governess. Joanna was so intimidated by Madame de Halwyn and Philip's councillors that she didn't dare to complain about her treatment. Joanna told her mother's envoy of her deep homesickness and how she felt the desire to cry every time she thought about how far away from her mother she was. In public, however, Joanna and Philip were the perfect couple. She was elegant and poised, he was approachable and well thought of. They dined together, and at state occasions, Joanna was dressed in the finest jewels and clothing. Philip publicly gave her lavish gifts of pearl and diamond necklaces, paintings and furnishings for her house, even gifting her an impressively large emerald on the birth of their first son, Charles. However, when their first child was born, their daughter Eleanor, Philip was unimpressed and stated that Joanna should pay for the child's nursemaids and household, as Eleanor was merely a girl. Philip, then, was clearly aware of covering up his reality with a glittering public image, and he understood how to manipulate that image in a way Joanna did not. The reach of his control was further shown in 1500, when Joanna refused to sign a document allowing Flemish ambassadors to broker a marriage proposal between her son Charles and the daughter of Louis XII of France. Her parents also didn't agree with the marriage, and although she eventually signed after pressure and threats, Joanna later refused again to sign orders concluding the marriage alliance. Philip simply declared that Joanna's signature was not required, treating Charles only as his son and removing his wife from the equation. Joanna must have consigned herself to this future, and yet things were about to change in an unseen way. In 1497, her elder brother Juan, the single male heir and hope for the Aragonese and Castilian thrones, died. This was followed by the death of her elder sister Isabella in 1498, who passed shortly after giving birth to Prince Miguel, who became the only male heir for the crowns of Portugal, Aragon and Castile on his mother's death. However, before he was even 2 years old, the child died in July 1500 in the arms of his grandmother, Queen Isabella. This rapid and saddening succession of deaths must have been heartbreaking for Joanna and her family, but it also left her in a place she had never dreamed she would be, as the heir to Aragon and Castile. Philip, however, had clearly considered the idea, as he had begun calling himself Prince of the Asturias just shortly after Juan's death. It was unlikely to have charmed his in-laws, especially as Joanna's elder sister Isabella was still alive and well at the time. When Joanna learned of her inheritance, she was pregnant, and it wouldn't be until the autumn of 1501 that she would travel with her husband and a Burgundian retinue to Spain. There, she was recognised by the Castilian Cortes of Toro as the heir apparent to the thrones, and she then signed her name in documents as Yo la Princesa instead of La Archiduquesa. Importantly, they recognised her son Charles as her successor, but her husband Philip merely as her legitimate consort. While the couple were in Spain, Isabella, who understood and disliked the ambition and controlling nature of her son-in-law, attempted to keep them both there as long as possible. If they stayed, Joanna could learn more about regal duty and the politics of ruling, and Philip could learn Spanish and more about the lands his wife and later his son would one day rule. But the Duke of Burgundy had no interest in this and departed as soon as possible, leaving Joanna, pregnant with their son Ferdinand, behind in Madrid. This was Isabella's chance to convince her daughter to remain in Spain by her side. For the first time, Joanna had a choice that was her own, but with pressure on both sides. It was heart versus head. Joanna knew Philip would allow her no control over her own life, but she still loved him despite that. Equally, she knew her strong-willed mother, who had once ridden into battle, would not hand her complete control either. But if Joanna stayed in Spain, it would reduce her dependency on Philip and grow a relationship with the Spanish people she would one day rule, and she would perhaps become a strong queen in her own right. While sources conflict on whether Joanna truly loved Philip or if she was content alone without him, she decided to go to her husband. Her mother did her best to convince Joanna otherwise, using the war with France as a reason not to travel through it. Knowing that Isabella was merely trying to delay her, Joanna reverted to a set of behaviours that she would fall back upon as her last form of self-control when pushed into a corner. She refused to eat or sleep, stood in the driving rain outside and refused blankets, and tried to force a ship's captain to set sail. Her hysterical behaviour was alarming for her mother and those around them, but they worked, and Joanna returned to Burgundy in May 1504. Upon arriving, instead of the loving welcome she might have imagined, Joanna was met with another of Philip's mistresses, and supposedly attacked the woman she believed to be her rival when her tears and tantrums failed to move her husband the way they had Queen Isabella. A few months later, in November 1504, Queen Isabella passed away, her health in decline since the death of her only son. This now left Joanna as Queen Regnant of Castile. While her father still held the throne of Aragon, he now, in theory, lost his monarchical status in Castile. However, Joanna was now about to be in the centre of a power struggle between two men who had no right to her crown but every desire to have it: her father and her husband. King Ferdinand, in his daughter's absence, took on the title of Governor and Administrator of Castile. While it wasn't the title of king, it was careful positioning as the stable presence required in the wake of the Queen's death. In 1505, King Ferdinand summoned the Cortes to hear Isabella's will and sanction his administration of Castile. In Isabella's will, she of course stated clearly that Joanna was Queen of Castile and Leon, and that all the lands within belonged to her. But she also put in an important clause. Isabella stated that in the case of Joanna being absent for her lands, or if she would not like or be able to govern them, her father King Ferdinand should take over for her until Joanna's then 4-year-old son Charles could take the reins. No reason was given for this clause, and it's often been suggested that viewing Joanna's hysterical behaviour made Queen Isabella worried that her daughter had inherited the mental instability of her own mother, Isabella of Portugal. But was there more to this? Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had made the joining of their separate kingdoms work by cooperation, and her husband had never sidelined her or tried to take her lands. This was clearly not going to be the case with Joanna and Philip. It's possible she was allowing for Ferdinand to push Philip to one side, much less Joanna. Whatever the case, Ferdinand decided to use this clause to claim it was due to his daughter's mental instability. When Isabella died, he of course publicly renounced his title as King of Castile, declared Joanna queen, and wrote to Joanna and Philip asking them to come to Spain. But in a statement given secretly to the Cortes, he claimed his queen's modesty and sorrow had prevented her from giving the true reasons for the clause. They then heard a lengthy account of Joanna's accidents, passions and impediments that overcame her, given by a disliked servant and signed by Philip. They unanimously agreed with Ferdinand, declaring him legal administrator and governor of Castilian lands. Philip, in signing the document, had inadvertently signed himself out of rule in Castile. In a counterattack, he declared that nothing in the account actually made Joanna insane, and a famous letter was sent to Ferdinand's ambassador in Burgundy, de Veyre, supposedly from Joanna. This was a letter she had edited 6 times, but refused to sign. The letter stated that she loved her husband and that she wanted Philip to rule in her place. The signature on this letter has since been proven a forgery. This shows a lack of respect for Joanna in a legal capacity, but also shows her own unwillingness to conform to the image of the submissive wife that the letter suggested, finding her own way to fight against the control exerted over her. And in public, she too fought against the claims of her madness, appearing at state festivities and functions as a perfect and graceful archduchess and queen. She was dignified and regal, responding beautifully to ambassadors who reported she was as normal as anyone else. In 1505, her father-in-law Maximilian visited Brussels, engaging in a torchlight joust alongside Philip for her entertainment. The Venetian ambassador noted that through all of these events, Joanna acted like a wise, prudent queen. This cast doubt on the claims against her, but it didn't stop them. The problem was that Joanna still played into Philip's hands by being so attached to him. Despite their tempestuous relationship, the couple was still sleeping together, and Joanna, possibly simply wanting to have some love shown to her and believing wrongly that Philip would, if his head wasn't turned by other women, would flare up with jealousy at the women who slept with her husband. Most queens in Europe ignored their husbands' mistresses, but Joanna was in a difficult position and likely suffering from depression. The waters were further muddied when Ferdinand, in an unthinkable move, allied himself with France by becoming betrothed to Germaine de Foix, the niece of Louis XII. Equally, Philip negotiated with France himself, raised his popularity in Castile by virtue of not being his father-in-law, who was not popular, and negotiated with Ferdinand. Before Joanna even set foot back on Spanish lands, Ferdinand and Philip had agreed without the rightful queen that the three of them would rule together in a 3-way system. This was all done with the agreement that the Queen's signature wasn't even necessary on any document, politically nullifying her further. For Philip, who obviously didn't care about Joanna except as a valuable commodity to power, allying himself with Ferdinand was a step towards having Joanna declared insane and locked away forever. Upon arriving in Spain in April 1506, both Joanna and Ferdinand had been fed misinformation. The father, that his daughter did not care about him and would see him removed from his position, and Joanna, that her father now hated her and didn't want her in Spain. This was spread, of course, by Philip. This meant that on arriving in Corunna, determined to rule but also wanting to keep her father on side, Joanna refused to confirm local privileges, invoking anger from the people of Corunna. But she simply wanted to ensure it was what Ferdinand also wanted. Joanna refused also to see envoys or speak to anyone until she had seen her father. It suited Philip, as keeping Joanna away from public view meant his lies about her insanity could be more easily believed. However, it was easier for Ferdinand to hang on to power by finding an accord with his son-in-law, rather than entreating with Joanna and risking war with her husband. So the pair continued to ignore Joanna and excluded her from the messy business of running a kingdom. Ferdinand agreed to leave the governing of Castile to Philip in exchange for control of its military orders and half the profits from the Indies. They also signed a second secret agreement in which they outright lied, stating that Joanna had no wish to rule, and even if she did, it would be to the total destruction and loss of those kingdoms due to her illness and passions which are not expressed here for modesty. In other words, it was best to leave it all to the men who already had control. Unaware of the treachery behind her back, Joanna decided for herself that she would go to meet her father. Using the excuse of a ride around the grounds of Benevente Castle where she was staying, Joanna instead spurred her horse with all haste to meet her father. She was pursued by Philip's soldiers and forced to concede to them, backed into the corner of a simple bakery. Joanna never attempted to escape again. Ferdinand, for his part, made no effort to visit his daughter. The Cortes met at Valladolid on the 9th of July, 1506, and a few days later swore allegiance to both Joanna and Philip as the Queen and King of Castile and Leon, and to their son Charles as heir apparent. Privately, Philip tried to encourage the Cortes to imprison her on the grounds of insanity, but they refused to do so without seeing her for themselves, and each time found her as normal as ever. Then, a few months later, Joanna's seemingly endless life of misery hit a crossroads. In September, the couple visited the city of Burgos. Within just a few days, Philip became violently ill. It was likely, in the days before modern medicine, a fever or infection that took rapid hold, but his death was so sudden, there were rumours his father-in-law had him poisoned. Whatever the truth, Joanna, once again revealing the turmoil of emotions she felt for her husband, opted to stay by Philip's side and nurse him, doing everything she could to keep him alive. It is difficult in a modern world to understand her actions, but Joanna had been raised a devout Catholic, and marriage was an unbreakable contract between man and wife, despite their differences, something her sister Catherine would also famously agree with. But on the 25th of September, Philip succumbed to his illness and died, finally leaving Joanna free of his abusive control. This should have been the glorious new beginning for Joanna. She was on home soil, she was free of her abusive husband and the control he had held over her. Joanna could now assert herself as a strong and legitimate ruler of Castile and Leon, free of Philip's ambitions. But a woman attempting to rule by herself would never be seen as the first choice, especially one with rumours of madness floating around her. While Joanna should have been at the start of a journey of freedom, building her legacy as a ruler, she was in fact about to become a victim once again, this time of another man who wanted her power for her own father, Ferdinand II. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.